Tonight marks the 4th week of Advent, and our story is The Straw by Alan Howard. Children, many strange and wonderful things happened on the night when Jesus was born in Bethlehem, but perhaps the strangest and most wonderful was what happened to a man named Judas who was living there in Bethlehem. Judas was a rich man, the richest in all the country round about perhaps, but nobody knew how rich he was for the simple reason that he never let anyone guess. He pretended by the way he lived to be very, very poor. In short, he was what we would call today a miser. He loved money, the look of it, the feel of it, even the thought of it, as he counted it out and let the beautiful gold and silver coins slip through his fingers. Doting over his money was his greatest joy in life. He kept all this money in a wooden box, which he hid in a hole in the ground inside his house. He covered the hole with a piece of wood, like a trap door. Over that he laid a piece of old carpet, and over that again he placed his rough table. And there, for the most part, his money stayed, except on those nights when he took it out to count it. And that was what he was doing on the night when Jesus was born. Not that he knew what was happening or even cared. There was only one thing in the whole world that Judas ever bothered about, and that was his money. So, after he made sure that no one was likely to disturb him, he pushed back his table, lifted up the piece of carpet, uncovered the hole, and took out his box of money. Setting it on the table, he opened it and smiled with delight at all that lay therein, when suddenly a knock came at the door. Now, who on earth could that be? People rarely knocked on Judas's door during the day, and as for nighttime, he could not remember when anyone had last come at that hour. It disturbed him, and his anxiety became worse when he remembered that he had not put the stout wooden bar across the door, as was his usual custom, every night. Suppose they should knock again, and not hearing a reply, come in and find him there with all his money. That was to be prevented at all costs. So, hastily snatching up a light, he made his way to the door. And what was his relief when he found, on opening it, only one of the serving maids from the inn a few yards up the road. But that did not prevent him from showing his resentment at being disturbed. "What do you want?" he asked indignantly. "Why do you come bothering me at this time of night?" But the girl was not to be put off by his surliness. It was not for nothing that she had come to his door. "Oh, Judas," she exclaimed, "would you let me have some straw, please? There is a poor woman up at the inn who has just come all the way from Nazareth with her husband to pay their taxes, and my master had nowhere to put them but in the stable. They didn't mind that, but since then she has given birth to a baby, and what a wonderful baby. But the only place we have to put the baby is in the manger, and we can't even do that yet because we haven't anything soft for the baby to lie on. We need some straw, so please let me have some, Judas, just enough to fill a manger." "Straw?" exclaimed Judas. "I haven't any straw." That was a lie, of course. He had a whole shed full of it at the back of his house, but he neither wanted to give any of it away. Yes, he was as mean as that. Nor did he want the trouble of fetching it, particularly while his treasure was lying open on the table. Anyone could come in and take it while he was doing so. "Go away and leave me in peace. It is nothing to me when babies are born or where they are born. Get off with you." The girl would have been only too pleased to do so. Nobody liked asking Judas for anything, and she herself was no exception. But the matter was urgent, and Judas so close at hand. "I will," she replied, "but please give me a bit of straw first, just enough to put in the manger for the little thing to lie on so that his mother can have some rest." "I tell you I haven't got any," he shouted at her. Raising his arm, he threatened to drive her away by force if she did not go at once. So the girl ran off as quickly as she could to try to find straw somewhere else. Meanwhile, Judas was just about to close the door when he saw a stranger standing where the girl had stood, and the stranger was looking at him with a very penetrating and reproachful look. Judas was so surprised that for a moment he could almost have believed that the girl had changed herself into this man. He had not seen or heard him come, and he could not have been there before the girl ran off, or she would have bumped into him. He seemed to have just materialized out of the shadows. Judas wanted to slam the door in the stranger's face, but there was something about the man's look that not only made Judas think better of it, but he suddenly realized he had no power in his limbs to do so. A strange feeling of awe and fear came over him, as though he were in the presence of a being from another world. He wanted desperately to say in his usual gruff manner, "What do you want?" But the words just would not come out any more than his arms or legs would move to close the door. "And would you not give a mere handful of straw to help a poor newborn child lie softly this night?" the stranger said at length, emphasizing each word so that Judas felt the full weight of his own meanness, and, to his credit let it be said, he also felt a tinge of shame at it. "How mean can you get, Judas? You with all your wealth." The mention of his name, and more particularly his wealth, startled Judas. Who was this stranger? Judas had never seen him before, and he dared not ask. He had the feeling that he was standing before a judge, and not just an earthly judge, but a judge of all mankind. He had often heard of the judgment day that was supposed to come after this life was over, but he had never believed it, nor bothered very much about it. But now he began to feel differently. He even wondered if, in some strange way, Judgment Day was happening right then and there, for he could see all his own mean, miserly life mirrored in the penetrating gaze of this stranger, who had meanwhile neither moved nor taken his eyes off Judas. "It must go hard with you, Judas," the stranger went on, "if you do not learn before you die that all your wealth is no better than straw in the eyes of God. The only wealth that any man has is what he gives away to those in need." And with that, the stranger disappeared as mysteriously as he had come, and Judas stood there staring out into the darkness like one in a trance, while those last words re-echoed in his mind. The only wealth that any man has is what he gives away to those in need. In a moment or two, however, Judas had snapped out of it, and muttering to himself, "I must be dreaming," the thought of what he had been doing before all this happened came back to him. So, dismissing it all from his mind, he shut and barred his door and made his way back to his room. Imagine then his amazement when he got there, and going straight to his box, he found that all his money had become straw. Yes, everything else was there just as he had left it, with the box standing open on the table, but instead of money, it was full of straw. He could not believe his eyes. This could not be so. He must be bewitched. Dashing forward, he began pulling out the straw and throwing it aside, only to discover there was no money there at all, not a single piece. As the last bit of straw dropped from his hand and he realized that all the money was gone, he sank, stupefied, to the ground. For a long time he just sat there like someone out of his mind, not speaking, not even thinking, just staring stupidly at that empty box, when only a few minutes before it contained all the wealth he had gathered through a long life of scrimping and saving, and of buying cheap and selling dear, not to mention quite a bit of lying and cheating too. Now it was all gone, and nothing remained but straw. Straw. Why, of course, he cried, as a sudden idea broke on his dazed mind, and jumping up from the ground he exclaimed, "That's it! I've been robbed! All that about the straw was a trick. While I was talking to her at the front, there were others who came around the back and stole my money." And without a thought of who they could have been, and how they could have got in, and why, after stealing his money, they should take the trouble to fill it up with straw, he yelled, "But they shan't get away from it." And leaving everything just as it was, he dashed away to the inn to find them. He had only a few steps to go. When he got there, it was all closed up and dark, but at the side where the stable was, there was a light shining beneath the door. "That's where they are," he said to himself. "They are in there, probably already sharing out my money among them. Now I'll be able to catch them in the very act." And creeping up to the door, he waited a few moments, and then he suddenly flung it open. For a moment, the light that poured out almost blinded him, so he had to stand there until he got used to it. When he did, instead of robbers, all he saw was a young woman in a blue gown holding a little child, from whom all this light seemed to shine in a wonderful glow on everything around, on the mother's face as she bent over the child, on the old man as he leaned on his staff, on the ox, everything, even now, on the face of Judas himself. They did not seem a bit disturbed, though the silence and stillness of it all quite unnerved Judas. He stood there with his hand still on the door, as motionless as they, like the one who has just stepped into another world. Presently, as his eyes wandered from one to the other, he found himself looking fixedly at a figure standing behind the woman and her husband. It was no earthly figure, and even Judas had heard enough about angels to know that he was now looking at an angel, face to face, for the first time. But no, not the first time. Only a few moments before, he had looked into that same heavenly countenance when he had driven the innkeeper's serving maid empty-handed from his door. A great fear fell upon Judas. He forgot all about what he had come for, all about his money. All he knew was that something was happening to him, and that if he didn't take notice of it, he might just as well be dead. He looked up at the angel, hoping that the angel had something to say to him to help him. But the angel had no eyes for Judas now. The angel was looking steadfastly at something in front of the little family group, something at Judas's feet. And as Judas followed the angel's gaze, his eyes too came to rest on an empty manger. He needed no words, either of angel or man, to tell him what that meant. For a moment, much, much shorter than it takes to tell you, as Judas looked into that empty manger, he once again saw his whole life come up before him. Not his past life this time, but the life he could have in the future, a life of joy and gladness with his fellow human beings, a life in which he could find the greatest happiness in taking part in their joy and sorrow, a life of giving and not just getting, a life of fellowship and not rejection. And it all depended on what happened to that empty manger. Now, it's hard to believe that a man's life can be completely changed in a short moment, especially a bad man's life. But it does happen, and it always starts with one simple thing he has to do. For Judas, it all centered around the manger. He knew what he had to do, and so... "Excuse me, ma'am," he heard himself saying in a voice that was so new to him that he hardly recognized it as his own. "But wouldn't you like to rest a while? Why not put the baby to sleep in the manger? I'll get you some straw for it." And without a moment's delay he ran out, and in what seemed like no time came running back with a great bundle of straw and some wool as well to go on top of it. In a moment he had made as comfortable a bed inside that manger as any child could need. Then when this was done, the miracle happened. At least it was a miracle for Judas. The miracle that changed his life, and as long as he lived, he never tired of talking about it. As Mary placed the child in the manger, the child's little fingers closed around just one wisp of straw that was sticking out from beneath the wool. When he was at last settled, he held out this piece of straw to Judas, and Judas, of course, took it. And then, though I know people will tell you that babies cannot smile until several days after they are born, this baby smiled at Judas. Whether it was that Judas learned by that smile, whatever it was that smile told him, it must have been something very wonderful, for he was a completely changed man afterwards. He went back home with that piece of straw in his hand and sat up half the night just looking at it and thinking of all that had happened. He did not bother about his money that was scattered all over the floor where he had flung it when he had come in first, for of course, as you have probably guessed, it was not really straw. He had only thought it was straw, for things like that can happen to people. It had been money then, and it was still money, but at the time, and the angel stranger must have had something to do with it, for angels can do things like that if they want to. Judas thought it was straw. But now, whether it was money or straw or anything else, Judas had no eyes for it. It was not until the next day that he noticed it at all, and then he just picked it all up and put it to one side, and before long it was gone. How? Gone, did you say? Why, he just gave it away. Whenever a poor beggar came to his door, or if ever he heard of anybody in distress, he just gave it away to help them. Before long, he was the most well-known and best-loved man in all Bethlehem, although some thought he was just a little bit crazy too. That happened whenever people spoke about treasure or riches, for he could not help telling them that he was the richest man in the world, and if those who did not know his story asked him to prove it, he took them back to his house. And there, after moving his table and taking up the old bit of carpet, and then moving the wood and lifting out his treasure box, he would open it and hold it up to their astonished and often disgusted gaze. He would hold up one small wisp of straw. But it really was treasure, his treasure. It had changed his whole life and had brought him happiness that he could never have imagined before. And though it must have seemed strange, to say the least, that a man should make so much of a bit of straw, and though one can understand how some people thought him a bit crazy, I, for my part, think there's a lot in what one man said about it all. He said, "If Judas is crazy, then I wish a few more people who believe themselves sensible could be as crazy as he is." And so ends our story that took place in Bethlehem over 2,000 years ago.